She thought she was alone, but an Apache watched over her in silence, Western love tales. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills and sparse trees, and yet, despite the beauty, a deep sense of loneliness weighed heavily on her heart. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders, feeling the morning chill, and let out a quiet sigh. For the past few weeks, ever since she had left the small town she once called home, the world had felt vast, unwelcoming, and impossibly empty. Every mile she traveled seemed to stretch her isolation even further. She was only 22, yet the responsibilities she carried on her young shoulders felt heavier than anything she had imagined. Her parents had passed away the previous year, leaving her alone with nothing but a few belongings and the modest savings her father had managed to leave. The decision to travel west had not been an easy one. Staying behind meant facing a future of uncertainty, dependent on distant relatives who might not even want her. The open frontier promised opportunity, freedom, and perhaps a chance to start over, but it also promised danger, loneliness, and hardship she could scarcely imagine. As the wagon rumbled slowly over the uneven trail, Clara kept her mind focused on practical matters. The horses needed to be fed, the wagon wheels checked, and she had to ensure her supplies would last at least until the next small settlement, which, according to her map, was several days' travel ahead. She had learned to be careful and precise. On the frontier, mistakes could be fatal. She reached for a small bundle of supplies and checked them: a few cans of food, a tin of matches, a small pot, and the modest amount of money she had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. Despite her careful planning, Clara couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that accompanied her every step. The wilderness, beautiful as it was, held hidden dangers she could not see. Wolves traveled in packs, sometimes closing in on travelers when the scent of fear reached them. Outlaws were another concern, men who had little respect for law or life, and who often preyed on the weak and vulnerable. Clara had heard stories in every town she passed about lone travelers who had vanished overnight, leaving behind wagons overturned and belongings stolen. These stories whispered warnings in her mind, reminding her that she was completely on her own. The sun climbed higher, and Clara felt a bead of sweat trickle down her temple. She stopped the wagon near a small grove of trees, hoping to give the horses a brief rest and find a little shade for herself. She unpacked a small portion of food, eating slowly and deliberately. She tried to focus on the simple pleasure of the warm bread and salted meat, but the silence of the plains pressed against her ears, and the feeling of being alone returned stronger than before. She missed the sound of conversation, the laughter of friends, and the quiet warmth of family. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to evenings spent by the fireplace listening to her mother tell stories of her own youth, or to the times when her father would patiently teach her how to mend clothes or repair a broken wheel. Those memories felt distant now, like a dream that belonged to someone else. As the day wore on, Clara set about making camp. She carefully tethered the horses, built a small fire, and arranged her few belongings around her. She was determined to keep moving forward, but the thought of sleeping alone in the dark wilderness made her stomach knot with anxiety. She tried to tell herself it was simply fear, a natural reaction to being in a place so far from human company. She reminded herself that countless travelers had made similar journeys and survived, and that she had skills her parents had taught her. She could cook, mend, and manage supplies. She could handle herself in ways many others could not. But still, the feeling of being watched, or at least the sense that the world was bigger and stranger than she could control, remained. As evening approached, Clara noticed small signs that made her pause. A footprint in the soft soil nearby, larger than any animal she had seen and slightly out of place. She scanned the horizon, squinting at the fading light. Nothing moved, but her heart beat faster. She told herself it was probably the wind, or an animal she hadn't yet recognized. Yet the uneasy feeling lingered, pressing at the edges of her thoughts. She moved closer to her fire, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding trees, listening to the whispers of the wind in the leaves and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. Night fell, and the temperature dropped sharply. Clara wrapped herself tightly in her shawl and settled near the fire, keeping one hand near her small knife. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, and she felt both awed and insignificant beneath the vast sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the distant sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. She tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the familiar routines she had established, but the solitude weighed heavily, and the darkness of the night seemed to stretch inside her heart. Despite her fear, Clara's mind refused to dwell on hopelessness. She thought about the future, about the life she hoped to build for herself in the West. She imagined a small cabin, a garden, perhaps a few friends in a nearby settlement who would come to know and respect her. She pictured herself riding her horse across open fields, free in a way she had never experienced before, her parents' teachings guiding her through challenges. These visions gave her strength, like a small flame resisting the cold night. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the imagined future sustain her until sleep could come, but sleep was uneasy. Clara stirred repeatedly, her senses alert to every sound. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, the low cry of a distant animal, all set her heart racing. Somewhere in the shadows of the trees, she felt eyes on her, though she couldn't see them. She whispered a quiet prayer for safety, telling herself that the wilderness was full of unseen watchers, some dangerous, some simply indifferent. She tightened her grip on her knife, and though fear curled through her chest, she reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. As the first light of dawn broke, casting a soft glow across the horizon, Clara awoke feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. She looked around the campsite carefully, noting that nothing had disturbed her supplies or her wagon. Still, the feeling that someone or something had been nearby persisted. She shook her head, telling herself that her imagination had probably gotten the better of her. Yet deep down, she could not ignore the sense that the vast, empty plains were not quite empty at all. Somewhere, perhaps watching from a distance, was a presence she could neither see nor name. Despite the uncertainty, Clara prepared to continue her journey. She fed the horses, packed her belongings, and checked her map once more. The path ahead was long and difficult, but she felt a renewed determination. The loneliness, she realized, was part of the challenge, and part of the strength she was slowly discovering within herself. With a deep breath, she climbed back into her wagon, her eyes scanning the horizon for danger, hope, or perhaps a hint of something she could not yet understand. As the wagon rolled forward into the wide, open plains, Clara felt the first glimmer of excitement about the journey ahead. Though she was alone, the wilderness seemed alive with possibilities, and she knew that each step she took would shape the person she was becoming. She could not see it yet, but the presence of an unseen watcher would soon reveal itself, a silent protector whose care would change her understanding of trust, courage, and even love. For now, though, she moved forward with caution, determination, and the quiet hope that she could survive, and perhaps thrive, in a world that had once seemed impossibly vast and empty. Clara had been traveling for several days across the vast plains, her wagon moving steadily along. The rugged trail. The mornings were cold and the nights were colder, but the sun warmed her as it rose over the horizon, painting the fields with shades of gold and orange. She had grown used to the quiet of the wilderness, but a small, nagging feeling lingered in her mind. It was subtle at first, like a shadow at the corner of her eye, but she could not ignore it. Someone, or something, seemed to be watching her. At first, Clara had dismissed it as imagination. The open land, the distant mountains, the lonely stretches of trail could play tricks on the mind. A cloud might cast a shadow that looked like a figure. A rock could appear to move when she turned away. Yet as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. Small signs appeared. A broken branch on the trail where she had just walked, the faint impression of a footprint that did not match her own, even the occasional rustle in the brush that did not belong to any animal she recognized. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, but a quiet part of her mind remained alert, watching the trees and the hills with growing suspicion. It was on the fourth day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, that Clara first truly noticed a presence. She had stopped near a shallow stream to give her horses a drink and fill her small water containers. As she knelt to scoop the water, she sensed movement in the trees across the stream, a flash of color, the shimmer of light on something that could have been a face. She froze, heart pounding, and looked carefully, but there was nothing there. The brush swayed gently in the evening breeze, and she shook her head, trying to laugh at herself for being jumpy. "Just tired," she whispered. "The wilderness makes your mind play tricks." Even so, Clara could not shake the feeling. As she finished watering the horses and packed up her supplies, she kept glancing around, scanning the trees and hills with careful eyes. There was something different about this feeling, less fear, more curiosity, as if someone was not there to harm her but merely to watch. She shook the thought away, but it lingered like a quiet echo in her mind. That evening, as she made camp near a small grove of trees, she noticed more signs. Her firewood had been arranged neatly when she returned from gathering more, and a few of her supplies that she thought were out of place seemed to have been moved carefully. Clara's first reaction was panic. Someone had been at her camp. But then she realized nothing had been taken, nothing had been disturbed in a harmful way. Someone had been there, but their intent was not clear. She looked around carefully, but the trees and shadows were empty. She sat down heavily, trying to calm herself, and wondered if she was imagining things. Over the next few days, the signs continued. A small bundle of fresh water appeared near her wagon one morning, left on a tree stump as if someone had anticipated her need. Once a branch that had been loose on the trail was pressed down carefully, making her path safer for her wagon. Every time she turned her eyes to investigate, the trees were empty, the hills calm and silent. Clara began to suspect that someone was following her, keeping watch without revealing themselves. Her curiosity grew alongside a quiet gratitude, though she would not have admitted it aloud. Whoever it was, they seemed to be protecting her rather than threatening her. One afternoon, as the sun reached its peak, Clara struggled with a heavy wheel of her wagon that had slipped into a rut. She grunted with effort, sweat dripping down her face, when suddenly she heard the faintest sound behind her, a movement in the grass, a whisper of a footstep. She froze, letting out a small gasp. Her hand went to the knife at her belt, ready for whatever danger might come. Then from the shadows, a man appeared. He did not speak. He simply gestured toward the wheel, then took hold of it with a strength that startled her. With a few firm movements, he lifted the wheel into place, aligning it carefully. Clara could only stare, unsure whether to speak or run. The man's presence was calm and steady. He did not make a sound, nor did he approach her too closely. His skin was tanned from the sun, and his eyes held a quiet intensity that seemed to read her thoughts. His clothing was simple, blending with the colors of the land, and his movements were precise, practiced, almost as if he had lived in the wilderness all his life. Clara felt a mixture of awe and fear. She wanted to thank him, to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you," and he inclined his head slightly, then retreated into the shadows before she could see him fully. After that encounter, Clara could no longer ignore the presence of the man who watched over her. She began to notice him in small ways. A shadow that moved just beyond her sight, footprints that appeared in the soil but disappeared before she could follow them, and items she needed left in convenient places. There was no sign of malice, only care. It was a strange feeling, knowing that someone was so close and yet so distant. She wondered who he was, why he cared, and whether he would ever speak to her directly. Despite the mystery, Clara's journey continued. She rode her horses across hills and plains, often glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see him there. Some nights when she made camp, she would leave small offerings, a bit of food, a warm blanket, or a note of thanks. She did not know if he would see them, but it gave her a sense of connection, however small. It was comforting in a way she could not explain, to know that someone else in the vast wilderness was aware of her struggles and, in their own quiet way, helping her survive. As the days passed, Clara began to feel less alone. The man's silent presence became a kind of companionship, though she did not yet know his name. She started to anticipate small signs of his help, and her fear of the wilderness began to lessen. The harshness of the land was still present, but knowing that someone watched over her made it feel less threatening. She began to think of him not as a stranger, but as a guardian, someone who understood the dangers of the world and had chosen to protect her without seeking anything in return. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and purple, Clara paused near a small hilltop overlooking the plains. The view was breathtaking, and she felt a surge of emotion, freedom, awe, and gratitude all mixed together. She realized that her journey was no longer just about survival. It was about trust, courage, and learning to accept help from others, even if that help came silently. She wondered about the man who had been following her, imagining the life he might lead in the wilderness, and felt a deep sense of respect for him. He had chosen to remain unseen, to offer aid without recognition, and that quiet strength moved her profoundly. That night, Clara made a small fire and settled nearby, feeling safer than she had in days. She thought about the man who watched over her, wondering if he would appear again, if she would ever speak to him, or if he would remain a mystery forever. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled with dreams of wide plains, quiet forests, and a presence that was protective, steady, and unassuming. For the first time on her journey, Clara felt that she was not truly alone. Morning came, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. Clara packed her wagon, fed her horses, and prepared to continue westward. The path ahead was long and uncertain, but she no longer faced it entirely alone. Somewhere out there, a quiet guardian watched over her, unseen but always present. The thought gave her courage, and she pushed onward with a determination that was stronger than fear. As she moved forward, Clara could not help but glance at the distant tree line, imagining the man's eyes following her progress. She did not know his story, his name, or why he had chosen to help her, but she knew that his actions were changing her journey. She felt a deep, silent gratitude for the presence that had appeared without warning and yet had become an invisible companion in her travels. The wilderness, once a place of fear and loneliness, had begun to feel like a living, breathing world, full of quiet surprises and unseen helpers. Clara understood in that moment that survival on the frontier was not just about strength and skill. It was also about trust, awareness, and the quiet bonds that could form even in the most unlikely of circumstances. She felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that the unseen watcher would continue to be a guiding force, silently protecting her as she carved her path through the western plains. The morning sun was just breaking over the horizon when Clara packed her wagon, her movements careful and deliberate. She had grown used to the rhythms of the frontier, knowing that each day brought challenges that could not be ignored. The horses were restless, their hooves stamping softly on the dry earth, and Clara offered them soothing words, patting their necks as she secured the harnesses. Her mind, however, was on the trail ahead, and on the quiet presence that had been following her for several days. The thought of the man, this unseen guardian, was both comforting and mysterious. She wondered who he was, and why he had chosen to watch over her without revealing himself. As she set off along the narrow path winding through the hills, Clara felt a strange mix of confidence and anxiety. The plain stretched endlessly before her, a tapestry of gold and green under the rising sun. Birds called from distant trees, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded her that life persisted even in these remote areas. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man appear among the shadows of the trees, but he never did. Still, she felt the reassurance of his presence, as if an invisible hand guided her along the safest route. The day wore on, and Clara's journey brought her near a small canyon where the trail narrowed sharply. The earth was uneven, and loose rocks made the path treacherous for the wagon. She urged the horses carefully forward, trying to keep the wagon steady, when she heard a sudden shout from ahead. Her heart jumped. A group of men, rough and worn from the road, appeared on the path, blocking her way. Their faces were hardened, their eyes scanning her with a calculating look. Clara's grip on the reins tightened, and she felt a surge of fear. "Hold it right there, girl," one of the men called, stepping forward. "This is our road now. Hand over your supplies and you can go without trouble." Clara's mind raced. She had little choice, yet she could not simply give up what she had worked so hard to carry. She shook her head, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't have much," she said. "Please, I mean no harm." "Let me pass." The men laughed, a rough, unpleasant sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "No harm," one sneered. "You're alone and that makes you easy. Now step out of that wagon." Clara's fear was sharp and immediate, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of determination rose. She had survived alone this far, and she would not give in without a fight. She gripped the reins firmly and prepared to defend herself as best she could. Her eyes darted to the surrounding rocks and trees, searching for a way to escape, when she noticed a subtle movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow shifted among the trees, too quick and precise to be part of the landscape. Suddenly, a figure appeared, moving with careful speed and purpose. It was the man who had been watching over her. He did not call out or make a sound. He simply appeared at the right moment, positioning himself so that the outlaws would notice him before they could fully focus on Clara. His presence was commanding, even without words. The men hesitated, their confidence faltering as they sensed the sudden arrival of someone else. Clara felt a surge of relief and awe. The man did not speak, but his intentions were clear. He had come to protect her. One of the men stepped forward aggressively, but the man moved with remarkable precision, blocking his path without a single wasted motion. The other men glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. They had expected an easy target, a frightened young woman alone on the trail, but now, faced with an unknown protector, their advantage seemed to vanish. The tension hung in the air for what felt like minutes, though it was likely only seconds. Clara's heart raced, her mind alert, but she felt an unexpected calm knowing she was not entirely alone. The man's steady, controlled movements gave her hope, and she realized that the danger might be avoided without violence if they were clever. Finally, the leader of the outlaws took a step back, reassessing the situation. "We'll see about this," he muttered, but his voice lacked the earlier confidence. He motioned for his companions to retreat, and slowly they stepped aside, allowing Clara's wagon to continue along the path. The man watched them disappear into the distance before turning toward Clara, his movements quiet, deliberate, and almost ghostly. Clara exhaled, her hands trembling as she gripped the reins. She wanted to speak to thank him, but words felt inadequate. She could only nod, her eyes meeting his briefly, and in that silent gesture, a deep gratitude passed between them. The man inclined his head once, then vanished into the trees as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Clara to continue her journey. As the wagon rolled along the trail, Clara's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, relief, gratitude, and curiosity all mingled together. She realized how much she had come to rely on the unseen guardian, even though she had never spoken to him. The wilderness, once terrifying and empty, now held a sense of connection, however mysterious. She thought about how carefully he had watched, how precisely he had acted, and how his presence had changed the outcome of what could have been a disastrous encounter. That night, Clara made camp near a small stream. Her hands still shook slightly from the adrenaline of the afternoon, but she felt a new sense of courage taking root within her. She prepared her modest meal, her mind replaying the events of the day. The man who had intervened was not a threat, not a stranger to fear or anger. He was something else entirely. He was skilled, cautious, and determined, yet he had acted without seeking recognition or reward. His presence had been silent, yet it had made all the difference. As she sat by the fire, Clara reflected on the nature of trust. The frontier demanded independence, strength, and vigilance, yet she had learned that even the strongest travelers could benefit from unseen allies. She thought about the subtle signs she had noticed in previous days, the small bundles of water, the careful adjustments to her supplies, the footprints that seemed to guide rather than threaten. It was all part of a quiet, careful protection, and she realized that this guardian had chosen to be a silent companion in her journey. The night was still, and Clara felt both awe and humility. She stared up at the stars, thinking about the vastness of the plains and the quiet strength of the man who had watched over her. She wondered about his life, his experiences, and the choices that had led him to this moment. Was he always a protector? Did he help others as he had helped her? She did not know, but she felt a deep respect for him, and a growing understanding that sometimes courage and kindness came not from words or recognition, but from action taken quietly, without expectation. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, Clara dreamed of open plains and shadowy figures moving in the distance, always watching, always protecting. Her dreams were filled with gratitude and curiosity, a mixture of wonder and comfort she had not known before. She awoke with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue her journey with a heart strengthened by the knowledge that she was not completely alone. The days that followed were filled with careful travel, as Clara continued along the winding trails and rolling hills. She remained alert, her senses attuned to the subtle signs of the wilderness, but the fear that had once dominated her thoughts began to fade. In its place was a quiet determination, a confidence born of experience and the realization that someone cared enough to watch over her. Clara began to notice the small details more keenly. The way the trees bent slightly in the wind, the sounds of distant animals, the patterns of clouds in the sky. She understood that survival on the frontier required not just skill, but awareness, patience, and respect for the land. And she understood, too, that the man who had intervened had chosen his moments carefully, acting only when necessary and leaving her free to learn, grow, and find her own strength. By the end of the week, Clara felt a profound change within herself. She was still cautious, still aware of the dangers that surrounded her, but she was no longer paralyzed by fear. The wilderness was no longer merely a place of isolation. It was a place of learning, of challenge, and of connection. The unseen guardian had not only protected her from harm but had taught her, in his silent way, the value of trust, courage, and resilience. As Clara traveled further west, she could not predict what lay ahead. There would be more obstacles, more moments of fear, and more trials to test her resolve. But she faced the future with a new understanding, that even in the most remote and dangerous places, kindness and protection could be found, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. She had learned that help could arrive silently, that courage could be quiet, and that survival was not just about strength, but about connection, trust, and the invisible bonds that tied people together, even in the loneliest of landscapes. Clara had been traveling for weeks. Across the western plains, Each day brought new challenges, narrow trails, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present sense of isolation. Yet, alongside these hardships, a quiet comfort had begun to grow within her. She was no longer completely alone. Somewhere in the shadows, watching from a distance, was the man who had saved her life, the silent guardian she had come to rely on without ever knowing his name. That morning, Clara awoke earlier than usual. The sky was a soft gray, the first light of dawn painting the horizon in muted shades. She moved carefully, tending to her horses and checking the wagon, making sure everything was ready for the day. The previous week's encounter with the outlaws had left her more cautious but also stronger. She trusted herself, her instincts, and the knowledge that someone unseen had her back. As she set off along the winding trail, she noticed a subtle sign, a small pile of fresh kindling arranged neatly near a bend in the road. She paused, realizing immediately that it was his work. A quiet smile spread across her face. It was as if he was saying, "I am here, but you must remain strong and aware." The trail led through rolling hills dotted with wildflowers. Clara rode slowly, taking in the scenery, but always alert. She had learned to read the land, to notice footprints, broken branches, and signs that someone or something had passed by. Her curiosity about the man had grown with each day. She wondered who he was, why he had chosen to help her, and whether she would ever see him face to face. The thought made her heart beat faster, a mixture of fear and excitement stirring within her. As the day wore on, Clara came to a narrow valley with a creek running through it. She stopped to give the horses a drink and let them graze. While bending to fill her water container, she heard the faintest rustle behind her. Her heart leapt, and she turned slowly, expecting to see danger, or perhaps the man himself. To her surprise, a figure emerged from the trees. He was calm, his movements deliberate and controlled. For the first time, Clara saw him clearly. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, held a quiet intensity that made her feel both nervous and reassured. The man did not speak. Instead, he motioned toward the creek, indicating that she should continue to fill her water and tend to the horses. Clara understood immediately. He had chosen this moment to make contact, but carefully, without forcing interaction. She nodded slightly, acknowledging him, and for a moment the two shared the same space in quiet understanding. Words were not necessary. The trust and respect between them had grown silently over days of careful observation and mutual awareness. After the horses were tended, Clara sat on a nearby rock, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and courage. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but sincere. The man inclined his head, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. He did not speak, but his eyes communicated something that words could not: patience, understanding, and a willingness to help without expectation. Clara felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet relief that someone she could rely on was real, tangible, and present. Over the next few hours, Clara and the man continued in parallel. He stayed slightly behind, never too close, yet always visible enough that she felt protected. When the trail became rough, she noticed subtle adjustments. Loose stones had been moved, the path cleared slightly, and branches bent aside to make the way easier for her wagon. She realized that he had not just saved her once. He had been preparing, guiding, and protecting her all along. A deep sense of gratitude filled her, along with a growing desire to understand him better. By late afternoon, they reached a wooded area, where the sun filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. Clara stopped to rest and eat, and the man approached cautiously, finally close enough that she could see the details of his face. Strong features, weathered by the sun and wind, yet calm and serene. His eyes held stories she could not yet know, but she felt a sense of familiarity, as if she had known him in some way for a long time. For the first time, Clara decided to try communicating. She drew a small symbol in the dirt, a simple gesture indicating thanks and respect. The man paused, studying it carefully, then responded with a similar mark nearby. It was simple, almost childlike, yet it was a bridge between them. Words were not yet needed. Understanding had begun to form through gestures, expressions, and shared awareness. She felt a thrill of connection, realizing that trust could grow even without conversation. As the evening approached, Clara prepared a small fire for warmth. The man watched from a respectful distance, never intruding yet always present. She offered him a small portion of her food, which he accepted with a quiet nod. It was a gesture, simple and profound, that marked the first real exchange between them. For Clara, it was a moment of human connection she had not realized she craved so deeply. In the harshness of the wilderness, kindness was rare, and yet here it was, quiet and genuine. The night settled over the forest like a velvet blanket. Clara sat by the fire, feeling a strange peace she had never known in the wild. The man remained nearby, a silent protector, his presence a calming force. They shared the space without words, and yet the unspoken communication was powerful. Clara reflected on her journey so far, the loneliness, the fear, the constant vigilance. She realized that the man had not just protected her physically, but had also offered a sense of emotional security. She could relax, even slightly, knowing she was not entirely alone in the vast wilderness. As darkness deepened, Clara spoke softly, testing the waters of communication. "You've been helping me for days, I don't even know your name." The man remained quiet, but he moved slightly closer, a gesture that suggested acknowledgement. Clara smiled faintly, understanding that trust could not be rushed. She had learned to be patient, and now she needed to give him the same courtesy. Sometimes the strongest bonds formed in silence, she realized, and words were not always necessary to convey care or loyalty. During the night, a soft wind rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Clara lay near the fire, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest, feeling the steady presence of the man nearby. She thought about the journey ahead, about the dangers she might face, and about how different it would be knowing she had someone watching over her. She felt a mixture of anticipation and comfort, realizing that the wilderness was no longer simply a place of fear and challenge, but also of learning, trust, and quiet companionship. The next morning brought a new opportunity for connection. Clara noticed the man watching her closely as she prepared the horses and wagon. She paused and gestured toward him, asking if he would help guide the wagon through a particularly rough section of the trail. Without a word, he stepped forward, demonstrating carefully how to navigate the uneven path. Clara followed his instructions, her confidence growing with each successful maneuver. It was the first time she had relied on him directly in action, rather than simply feeling protected from afar. By midday, they had traveled several miles together, the sun high in the sky, warming the earth and the horses. Clara began to talk quietly to him as they moved, telling him about her journey, her fears, and her dreams. Though he did not speak in return, his attentive gaze and careful gestures provided all the responses she needed. He nodded, pointed out hazards, and offered silent guidance, demonstrating a bond that transcended words. Clara realized that communication could take many forms, and that trust and understanding were often stronger when spoken quietly or shared through action rather than conversation. As the day drew to a close, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude. The man's presence had become a source of strength and inspiration, teaching her not only how to survive the wilderness, but also how to trust, observe, and act with patience and awareness. She realized that their bond was rare, a connection forged through shared experience, careful attention, and mutual respect. It was quiet, unassuming, yet powerful, a kind of companionship that could endure even in the harshest conditions. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and the man made camp together for the first time. She built a small fire, and he sat a short distance away, respecting her space but remaining close enough that she could feel his protective presence. They shared a meal silently, and Clara found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. She felt seen, understood, and cared for, even without words. She realized that this was the heart of her journey, not just survival, but connection, trust, and the quiet bonds that could form in the most unexpected ways. As night settled over the plains, Clara lay near the fire, reflecting on all that had happened. The man who had once been a shadow now felt like a companion, a guide, and a protector. She understood that their journey together had only just begun, and that there was much to learn from him, not just about the wilderness, but about courage, patience, and the quiet power of trust. For the first time, Clara felt a sense of hope and possibility that went beyond mere survival. She knew that together, even in silence, they could face whatever lay ahead. The morning air was crisp and clear as Clara prepared to continue her journey. The sun rose over the plains, casting long shadows across the rolling hills, and the warmth of its rays offered a gentle comfort. She tended to her horses with practiced care, feeding them and checking their harnesses. Her wagon was packed and ready, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a mixture of excitement and calm. She was no longer entirely alone. The presence of the man who had quietly watched over her gave her a confidence she had never known before. The man approached silently, as he always had, and Clara met his gaze. She no longer felt fear in his presence. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between them, a bond built over days of shared experience, trust, and careful observation. He did not speak, but his eyes communicated reassurance, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude. She had come to rely on him, not just for protection, but as a guide through the challenges of the frontier. As they moved forward together, Clara reflected on all that had happened. She remembered the lonely days of her journey, the nights spent by the fire listening to the sounds of the wilderness, and the first terrifying encounter with the outlaws. Each memory brought a mixture of fear and awe, but now she saw them in a new light. Every trial had taught her something important: courage, patience, vigilance, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing someone cares, even without words. The trail led through a dense forest that cast shadows across the path, making it more difficult to navigate. Clara guided the horses carefully, paying close attention to the uneven terrain. The man walked slightly behind, observing her movements, ready to intervene if necessary. It was a rhythm they had developed over time, a silent cooperation that allowed them to move safely through the wilderness. Clara felt a deep appreciation for his skill and presence, understanding that his guidance had been invaluable. Midday brought them to a wide, open meadow dotted with wildflowers. Clara stopped to rest the horses and offered them a chance to graze. She gathered some water from a small stream and prepared a modest meal. The man watched from a distance, his posture relaxed but alert. Clara decided it was time to try a more direct form of communication. She drew simple shapes in the dirt, asking questions about his journey and his life. To her relief, he responded with marks of his own, a silent conversation that allowed them to understand each other more deeply. Through these gestures, Clara began to learn more about the man who had been her guardian. She understood that he was skilled in survival, patient, and guided by a strong sense of honor. He had chosen to help her without expecting anything in return, and his actions were guided by respect and careful thought. Clara felt a profound sense of admiration for him, realizing that his quiet strength was a gift that had shaped her journey in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. As the afternoon wore on, they continued along the trail, the sun casting warm light across the plains. Clara's mind wandered to thoughts of the future. She imagined reaching a small settlement where she could rest, gather supplies, and perhaps even begin a new life. Yet she also felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of parting ways with the man who had become her silent companion. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if he would simply fade back into the wilderness as he always had. By late afternoon, the trail brought them to a small hill overlooking a river valley. Clara stopped to admire the view, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had come so far, both physically and emotionally, and the journey had changed her in ways she could not have imagined. The man approached, standing silently beside her, and for a moment they simply looked out over the landscape together. There was no need for words. Their shared experiences had created a deep understanding that required no explanation. That evening, they made camp near the river. Clara built a small fire, and the man sat a respectful distance away, as he always had. She offered him a portion of her meal, which he accepted with a quiet nod. As they ate in silence, Clara reflected on the lessons she had learned. The wilderness had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had also taught her resilience, independence, and the value of trust. She realized that the man's presence had been a gift, not only protecting her but also helping her grow stronger and wiser. Night fell, and the stars shone brightly in the clear sky. Clara lay near the fire, listening to the gentle sounds of the river and the rustling leaves. The man remained nearby, his presence a comforting reminder that she was not entirely alone. She thought about the journey ahead and the challenges she might still face, but she no longer felt the fear that had once dominated her thoughts. Instead, she felt confidence, hope, and a deep sense of gratitude. Over the next few days, Clara and the man continued to travel together. Their silent communication became more natural, and Clara found herself relying on his guidance while also learning to trust her own instincts. The bond between them grew stronger, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and quiet acts of care. Clara realized that this connection was rare and precious, a reminder that even in the most isolated and challenging environments, human kindness and support could flourish. Eventually, Clara reached the outskirts of a small settlement. The sight of buildings, people, and familiar activity filled her with relief and excitement. She knew that she could rest, resupply, and perhaps find a place to begin anew. Yet, she also felt a pang of sorrow at the thought of leaving the man behind. He had been her guardian, her silent teacher, and her companion in a world that had often felt lonely and dangerous. She wondered how she could ever thank him adequately for all he had done. The man remained a few steps behind as Clara approached the settlement. She turned to him, and for the first time their eyes met fully. In that gaze, she saw understanding, acceptance, and quiet pride. There were no words spoken, yet everything was communicated in the unspoken connection between them. Clara knew that he had chosen to remain in the wilderness, guiding and protecting others in ways she might never know. She felt gratitude, respect, and a profound sense of admiration for his strength and selflessness. Before entering the settlement, Clara knelt and drew a symbol in the dirt, a simple mark of thanks and remembrance. The man observed it carefully, then responded with a mark of his own, acknowledging her gesture. It was a silent farewell, a moment that encapsulated everything they had shared: trust, guidance, care, and mutual respect. Clara felt a deep sense of closure, understanding that their journey together had shaped her in ways that would stay with her forever. As she walked into the settlement, Clara carried with her a newfound strength and confidence. She knew that the lessons she had learned in the wilderness, courage, patience, awareness, and trust, would guide her in the life she hoped to build. She also carried the memory of the man who had watched over her silently, a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, kindness and protection could exist, quietly and without expectation. The days and weeks that followed were filled with work, discovery, and the slow building of a new life. Clara found shelter, connected with the local community, and began to establish routines that brought stability and purpose. Yet she never forgot the lessons of the wilderness, nor the presence of the silent guardian who had guided her along the way. His influence remained with her, shaping her decisions, her courage, and her understanding of trust and connection. Clara often thought back to the times they had shared, the first sight of him in the trees, the intervention during the encounter with the outlaws, the quiet moments by the fire, and the lessons learned through silent communication. Each memory was a reminder that courage could be quiet, that trust could be built without words, and that true care often came from actions rather than speech. She carried these lessons with her, knowing that they would continue to guide her for the rest of her life. Months later, as Clara worked to establish her small home in the settlement, she would sometimes look toward the horizon, imagining the man moving through the wilderness. She wondered about his life, the paths he traveled, and the other travelers he might be helping along the way. Though she did not know where he was, she felt a profound connection, a sense of gratitude that transcended distance and words. He had shaped her journey, and his presence had left an indelible mark on her heart. Clara understood, finally, that love and care could take many forms. It did not always need to be spoken or declared. Sometimes it was silent, steady, and enduring. The man had taught her that even in the harshest, loneliest places, trust, guidance, and quiet protection could exist. And in that understanding, Clara found strength, courage, and hope, a knowledge that would guide her through all the journeys yet to come. The story of her journey across the western plains and the silent guardian who had watched over her became a memory she cherished. It was a testament to human kindness, resilience, and the quiet, enduring bonds that could form between strangers. Clara had thought she was alone at the beginning of her journey, but she had discovered that even in the vastest wilderness, there was someone watching over her, someone whose care and guidance had helped her survive, grow, and find a new life. As the sun set over the settlement, casting warm light across the rooftops and streets, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She had traveled far, faced danger, and learned to trust both herself and others. And though the man who had guided her remained a figure of the wilderness, unseen and mysterious, his presence had been real, powerful, and transformative. Clara knew that the lessons he had taught her would remain forever, a silent legacy of courage, trust, and quiet love in a world that often demanded strength and resilience.